Hello and welcome to Code Green, a podcast series where we explore the intersection of climate action and artificial intelligence in Asia. I'm Urvashi Aneja, the founder and director of Digital Futures Lab. We are an India-based research organization that examines the impact of technology on society in the global south. Through evidence-based research, systematic foresight, and public engagement, we work to realize equitable, safe, and sustainable digital futures for all. This podcast is accompanied by a monthly newsletter where we showcase the latest scientific and socio-technical research at the intersection of AI and climate action. You can access both the podcast and our newsletter at codegreen.asia. This podcast is supported by Earth Venture Foundation, a not-for-profit initiative that supports scientific research to advance climate action. In this episode, we delve into the topic of geospatial AI and climate action. To explore the opportunities, challenges, and risks, we are joined by Kathy Richards and Isni Zahidi. Kathy is the Associate for Digital Resilience and Emerging Technology at the Engine Room. Recently, as a Green Web Fellow, she investigated the role of communities along with emerging and security risks associated with using GIS for environmental justice. Isni is a civil engineering academic at Monash University, Malaysia, with over 16 years of experience, including in industry. Her primary research is in using remote sensing, GIS, and modeling to develop sustainable and climate-resilient communities. Kathy discusses how the availability of GIS databases improved access to map-making, allowing communities to tell their own stories and control their data, but also cautioned against associated risks and challenges. Isni spoke about her work using geospatial AI for flood risk management, highlighting the role of consistent engagement with communities and ground-up approaches for successful solutions. Let's jump right into the conversation. So Kathy, Isni, so great to have you on this show, and thank you for joining us. Kathy, perhaps I can start with you. In your work, you talk about how the creation of GIS systems has revolutionized map making, and it's putting the ability to create complex maps in the hands of everyday people. So can you talk a little bit more about this? What is the potential? How have we been able to democratize map making? And perhaps what are the implications from a climate action perspective?
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Yeah, I think like many technologies, it's definitely made highly technical things a little bit easier for people that don't know about the technology or haven't studied it. Coding is one. I know we have a lot of no-code tools that allow people to drag and drop things and create a website or create an app. But the same thing has happened in GIS. Cartography is a highly technical field, as is geography. And back in the day, if we see in many movies people with their little compass and doing all sorts of drawings. It requires some study, it requires some learning. But what a lot of these platforms have been able to do is to some extent abstract away all the technical things. You can load a map and then add data on top and things like that. So now it's more at the click of a button. I will say that with each passing year, the platforms get even easier to use. There's a few in particular that have come out that further abstract away all the technical decisions that you might have had to make, either as a cartographer or using the more advanced systems. So in some ways, it's fantastic for climate action because a lot of these communities that are dealing with the biggest threats, they do not have the resources to learn how to use these tools, don't have the time as well. There's just so many things that we're constantly dealing with. Many people that work in organizations are wearing multiple hats. So you might be the comms person, but also trying to figure out how to make a map to tell a story. So in many ways, like, these tools being easier to use is just fantastic for climate action because it really means that communities can tell their own stories, hold their own data is a big one too, not having to send it off to an external party to have them to tell their story. So that's been fantastic. But of course, with everything, there comes risks. I think and I'll talk about this a bit later, but one of the things that has happened in the last couple months of the fellowship was just the creation of GeoAI, or not so much the creation, but just the implementation of GeoAI into more platforms. So that's another layer of abstracting away the technology and the decision-making behind it. So in that case, for me, it's been really important to figure out a way to document the most important things about the maps that we create to make sure that we are telling the stories that we want to tell, that we are protecting our communities, that we are doing all the things the right and responsible ways. So that's been one of the biggest things that I've seen.
Great, thank you. And just for our listeners to be able to imagine this a little bit better, are there some examples you can give, or when you're talking about platforms, are you referring to some in specific, just so that they can visualize what this might look like?
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the biggest platforms is from Esri, ESRI. It's called ArcGIS. It comes in very many different flavors, so we'll just talk about that primary one. It is a fantastic tool. I will say sharing does not mean necessarily an endorsement, but it is a fantastic tool. It has a lot of different options. It does with certain, I won't say like difficulties, but things that requirements that communities need to consider. For example, it only works on certain computers. For example, it only works on Windows, and it needs to have a certain amount of memory because it requires a lot of resources. Also, in some ways, the fact that there's so many options means that it's not that easy to get started. I consider myself pretty tech savvy, and I know when I opened it, I was like, where do I go? There's so many options here. So in that case, that's the original, sometimes the gold standard for GIS. But there are also kind of alternative versions to ArcGIS. One in particular that I love is QGIS, which is open source. And it comes with very many plugins for people. For example, one of the ones that I mentioned in the guide is around kind of privacy enhancing, making sure that you obscure away the locations of certain data points so that, let's say, you're pinpointing community members and things like that, that you obscure it away so that they remain safe. The fantastic thing about QGIS is that there is a large community of people contributing to it. Um, so essentially, you'll always have someone to ask questions to, but it does have the same level of complexity as ArcGIS. You'll be able to do all the analysis, mapping, things like that. And then there's a new player in the field, Felt Maps, which are done used completely in the browser and absolutely gorgeous, but it does have its limitations around, for example, the models you can use and things like that. So in some ways, like I mentioned, to make it easier to use, sometimes you have to remove a lot of features, but also it's fantastic because you can just do it in the browser and not have to worry about getting a new computer or any other things like that.
Thanks. That's super helpful because now I recognize some of the names that you mentioned, and I can also visualize it a lot better. Isn't so? What is the role of AI in this? What do you see as the opportunity areas for integrating AI based modeling with GIS data?
Okay, so in integrating AI with GIS data, or a more common term, Geo AI or Geospatial AI, the applications are diverse, as you can imagine. But at least in terms of what my research team is working on, directly related to our topic in this podcast, the opportunity areas for climate action are flooding and urban heat island effect. Now, flooding is the number one natural disaster in a lot of Asian countries, Malaysia included, and every year, especially for the vulnerable communities, we face significant flood damage, both directly and indirectly. So we're not just talking about the economic consequences, but also social and environmental impact due to flooding. And you add in climate change and urbanization, it becomes worse in terms of the severity and the frequency of extreme events. And urbanization also leads to a significant increase in temperature within urban areas like Kuala Lumpur. So this phenomenon is called the urban heat island effect. So the consequences of the urban heat island effect include increased energy consumption, heightened public health risks related to heat, but understanding and mitigating flooding and urban heat island effect, because they have lots of variables, indicators, and factors, they can be very costly and time consuming. So, with the advancement of technology and machine learning, and also the availability of geospatial data, geospatial AI would be a way forward in tackling these challenges in a wider scale.
Got it. And you also do a lot of work with communities, right? You engage with communities in this process, whether it's around kind of flood management or other forms of natural resource management. And that strikes me as really inspiring because what we see otherwise in the kind of AI and climate action space is a lot of top down solutions. So I'd love to know a little bit more about this work on your engagement with communities. How do you involve them in this process? Are there certain challenges or limitations that you've seen? And what for you is the kind of way forward?
Okay, I suspect we're going to discuss this more as we go on. But To begin with, when it comes to flooding and urban heat island effect, understanding historical land use changes is crucial for evaluating the hazard risk. Land use change refers to the alteration of land's purpose by human activities over time. So these activities such as agriculture, deforestation, urbanization, they can significantly transform land use, often with severe cumulative effects. So, one of the critical impacts of historical land use changes is the influence on flood hazard and urban heat island effect. Changes in land use, such as converting forests into agriculture or urban areas, can lead to increased runoff and flood risk, as well as urban heat island effect. And that's because the land's natural ability to absorb rainfall and bring down the temperature decline. By tracing these historical changes, we can identify key factors contributing to flooding and urban heat island effect. So we're applying geospatial AI by using machine learning algorithms not only with remote sensing and historical data, but also verifying and getting data from local communities to help inform us better, because some of these variables, factors, indicators are site specific. So at the end, we want to have informed and inclusive decisions in optimizing, for example, in our case, land use planning to mitigate flooding and urban heat island effect.
And in terms of like then collecting this data or engaging with communities and collecting this data, are there any challenges that you see? Is it easy? Is it complicated? Is there a skills kind of training that is required for them to be able to participate in these processes?
We try to make it easily translated. For example, I have this study in public social values of land use in flood management. So the social values of land use, they are often excluded in integrated flood management because they are harder to quantify. So we use a GIS application to assess, map, and quantify the perceived social values of flood-prone land use in the specific study area. So this approach is based on a non-monetary value index calculated from responses to a quantitative social survey on the local community's attitude and preference toward flood management across different land uses. So we make it easy. We ask local communities their familiarity with the area, such as when and how often they visit, if they derive any income from the study area, and their interest level in what happens to the area, level of concern and preference regarding flood damages and mitigation measures on the selected land uses, and a few other questions. And then we define them by quantitative method, a 5 point Likert scale, for example, ranging from 1 strongly favor to 5 strongly opposed. They also have to mark the locations based on the social values like aesthetic, biodiversity, cultural, health, historical, recreation, tourism, which we then digitize into a GIS layer. And then we overlay this layer with the flood extent layer, which is more technical aspects of flooding, flood depths, and flood depths not most of the time. Then these areas which local communities perceive as crucial for flood management. So we take into account their opinions, but make it easy to collect this. And this really helps to evaluate land use trade offs by considering their social values when prioritizing flood mitigation measures or investments.
Got it. I think that's fascinating. And also because in this kind of big data driven world, often when we think of data, we think of specific types of data and data that can be very easily quantified and measured. And often that contributes to an exclusion of community perspectives and the softer, more intangible aspects of their relationship with the land, their relationship with the ecosystem. And we also, in some of our work on AI and climate action, one of the risks that we've seen is the potential of undermining local knowledge systems or overriding local knowledge systems. I think this is a really interesting example example in the work that you're doing and how one can integrate these kind of bottom-up perspectives and put them at the center of thinking about how we use AI and other advanced technologies rather than it only being a kind of top-down approach. Kathy, I'd love to hear from you on this as well. You've written some about how kind of low-cost IoT devices can be used for low-resource communities for climate action work, whether it's resource management or conservation. Are there some use cases that you've come across where communities have been able to effectively leverage such remote sensing data and technologies for climate action in the geographies that you work in?
Yeah, there's actually quite a few examples that I love. I'll share a few, but I will probably start with also talking about the technology itself, what it really means, not just it's a little device that allows people to collect data remotely, but it also means that, for example, park rangers can use this to supplement the guarding of the nature reserves or the conservation areas. It helps keep them safe as well. Also, what might require 24 hours of manual human data collection you might be able to do with just this device. So it definitely opens up a world of opportunities, not just it's a device that's doing things on its own. It really has a lot of benefits to communities. So personally, a few of my favorite ones, in one case for environmental justice, I've heard of an initiative that was using air quality sensors to monitor the air around last mile delivery hubs. Just in case listeners don't know what the last mile delivery hubs are, they're essentially the hubs that facilitate the rapid delivery of products from major retailers. That way people can get things next day. So it's essentially almost like mini warehouses located within communities. The thing there is that quite often they place these delivery last mile hubs in low income communities of color, things like that. So what that means is that there's constant noise pollution, air pollution as well. That's one of the big ones. So what one initiative is doing is they're placing these IoT sensors, air quality sensors, to monitor the air within these communities. Because even though the government does have air quality sensors, it's not to the extent that you can say this community in particular is being harmed by this. So I did love that. In particular, it really meant that the community is able to say, this is our air is not well, or even maybe in the future, the noise quality, I can't sleep at night and then I have to go to work or go to school, whatever it might be. I've also seen many groups use soil monitors to monitor water more efficiently. The sensors can be integrated into cell phones and computers and things like that to have real-time awareness of soil moisture levels, but it can also monitor many things, and that can help reduce water demand. Farmers can understand whether the water levels are good enough or if they need something, and it really helps them not have to rely so much on just a feeling, and also can automate a lot of other things. There's also monitors or IoT sensors that are used to monitor where animals are. So it can really help with controlling diseases. Let's say if one animal in particular has a condition and they're trying to keep it away from the other animals, they can use that to track how the community is moving, how the disease might spread, etc. And then another favorite case in Kenya, and I can share links for all of these. They're using multiple sensors to just kind of enlarge and improve on the conservation areas such that they were able to actually take down fences and enlarge the area for the animals to walk around because they had these sensors to help them monitor. It was also a cross-conservancy effort, which is why they were able to take down the fences and create a larger area for the animals. But they were using it, as I mentioned before, for park rangers to kind of sense when there might be poachers around and be able to go specifically to those areas and not have to constantly be on guard. It was also outside of tracking if there's poachers. They also tracked the ranger vehicles to see how far away they are, things like that. Also, obviously tracking the animals, and then also tracking just the environment around them. How's the water? How are things? I just created this whole environment, completely networked, that allowed the animals to have quite a bit more space to roam.
Those sound like really fascinating examples. And I was wondering, like, what do you think made them work, right? Like, was it organizations that had deep roots in the community, or was it about having the patient kind of finance and philanthropic kind of capital? Like, what made these examples become these success stories? Because if we have to try and think about how we might want to replicate them, then I think thinking about those enablers and drivers would be really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I do feel like the community is a big part of it. Capacity building of the community. I've seen quite a few efforts where they're training school students in the school to use these and to maintain these devices. So really getting the community involved, getting them to understand that these are to help them, and also creating that space where if they might feel like this is surveillance or whatever it is that they might feel, that they can give that feedback. So really ensuring community ownership. That to me is huge, I think, with any sort of technology. And I think that's one of the differentiators with IoT devices. These are low cost, let's call them mini computers, that communities can use around their area to track what they might need to track. But it really means that they own it, as opposed to, let's say, a government using their satellites, or a set of scientists coming in from abroad and collecting data and then walking away with it. These devices facilitate community ownership of the data. So that's one of the great things. But with that said, I will always say that funding is important. I think what often happens in the sector is there's a lot of funding at the beginning for implementation of it. And we have this great idea, let's use this new emerging technology. But then the maintenance is a thing that you then have to go back and fundraise for and justify if you didn't initially put it into the implementation. So I think funding is still an issue. We see it a lot in our work, not just with IoT devices, but just with technology as well. Maintenance is still a huge thing. These technologies will not just change, but they also will need to be repaired. And people will need to be retrained on it. So it's thinking about the long term of the funding is really important.
I'm so glad you brought up the maintenance issue. I think it's so overlooked, whether it's in kind of technology for climate action or any other kind of technological intervention, particularly in like low resource context. We spend so much money on the pilot and the early stage investment and very little on the maintenance. Does that kind of resonate with your experience in Malaysia as well? Like, what do you think are what are the potential kind of enablers or drivers for being able to engage communities more in this work and having their needs and their ownership in some sense of the problem space of the data? Does that resonate with your experience in Malaysia and some of the work that you've been doing in the region?
Yes, actually, what Katie has been talking about reminds me of another part of the work that we're doing. We're looking into nature-based solution for flooding, like afforestation or wetlands, instead of purely grey infrastructure or structural measures. For example, traditionally we look at only flood extents and flood depths to determine the best place to implement these nature-based solutions, but we never speak to the local communities. And we learned that a successful long term implementation of nature based solutions relies on constant local engagement when they feel the ownership and in areas where they would benefit the most. When how do we know this? So rather than considering only the flood extents and depths, the technical parts of the flooding, we are shifting towards an integrated flood risk assessment methods, integrating these physical flood aspects that we train by AI with the potential consequences of vulnerability levels for site specific communities to provide a more holistic assessment of flood risk. Locations with higher flood depths may not necessarily sustain severe damage. Conversely, areas with shallower flood depths could incur significant damages and losses depending on the vulnerability of that specific area and communities. So this is where local communities play an integral role in the decision making and development process. The opinion and feedback from local communities help to identify the crucial aspect of flood risk that should be emphasized or further analyzed to propose effective long-term mitigation measures that lead to minimizing overall flood impacts. So basically, methodologies used to quantify flood risk should have active stakeholder involvement, especially the affected local communities through the process from the start to the end. And this is important to determine the most vulnerable locations, which will be vital when stakeholders, local government agencies are developing effective flood risk reduction strategies. Only then would nature based solutions, in our case, be effective in offering flood protection with the highest benefits without impacting the local environment. Yeah.
And you see that happening currently? Do you see that kind of integration with or participation, involvement of local communities in nature based solutions? Because there's now a lot of financing and a lot of kind of investment in nature based solutions, particularly in the Asian region.
Unfortunately, not really. All our work so far has been quite conceptual. And as we speak to local communities, they often say that their voices are not being heard or are not being used in the decision making. And I think what we learn is also we need to reduce the technical complexities, lower the barrier, use simple language, and people understand visuals better. So geospatial AI has that advantage over traditional AI. So same fundamentals but represented spatially. Different stakeholders and government agencies, decision makers, the local communities, they have different priorities or interests too. So, for example, government agencies would be more interested in the technical details of a natural disaster, whereas the local communities might be just interested to know whether their houses or farms are at risk and what they can do about it. So, when you go to them with all this technical complexity, then you won't be able to get their feedback effectively. So, I think if you want to open this decision making to everyone, I think we need to lower the barrier, but this has to be part of a policy. Otherwise, I don't really see it happening. Yeah.
I think that's such an important point, right? That like technology in some sense has to meet people and where they're at, rather than be this assumption
Mhm.
that people need to upskill or develop new skills and capacities to meet technology where it's at, right? So I think it's a shift in how we think about what technology should be and how it can really help people and serve their needs. I think that kind of takes us quite nicely into talking about some of the risks, some of the ethical risks, some of the potential social risks. And I know, Kathy, you've done a lot of work on this, thinking about some of these risks in this space. And I'd love to know a little bit more about what concerns you. What do you think are the biggest ethical and social risks?
Yeah, totally. Thank you. I think, yeah, as I mentioned before, I was starting from the platforms themselves. Quite often, the easiest ones to use, you're hosting your data in the cloud. You're providing all this data to these organizations or to these companies. And quite often, how often do we all read the privacy policy or look for information on encryption or data security? So that's one of the underlying concerns around the platforms. Where is this data going? How is it being used? Especially if now we're talking about Geo AI and their models being trained. Are the models being trained on our data? I think we've all kind of gone through that in the last year or so, where quite a few companies, Google, et cetera, will send out an email saying, or Zoom as well, will send out an email saying, we'll potentially use your calls and your data to train these models. And that's when everyone kind of starts to flag things. So that's one of the things, the concrete things that the platforms really need to be really clear around how they use the data, if they're going to start using it for Geo AI or for whatever purpose. Are they keeping it safe, et cetera? I think the other thing too is just addressing the transparency of the systems. One of the things that I found out during the fellowship was that, for example, there are certain data types that are quite often used on web map making platforms that actually make it easier for a hacker to be able to go in and download the data. And so things like that you wouldn't really find out unless you've been deep diving into the platforms for several months. And we love a good web map, Google Maps, all the things that we use, it's on the web right now. So that's really important, as you mentioned, meet people where they are. Quite a lot of the documentation that I found was very technical, was meant for a specific type of audience. And so we have to be like really clear on what all these different features mean. Yes, you can make a web map, but your data might be insecure if you're using it for something that someone might need. I'll also add that the actual underlying data, for example, for ArcGIS and many of the platforms, they have different models of our planet that you can download and use. In some cases, free, in some cases with the subscription, which I'll also get to. Um, but quite often, and that's another thing that I mentioned, these models are very Western centered. They're from a specific point of view. They are the default. So again, that's kind of one of the things where please share with people that the default model might not actually work in your context, and you might be making wrong assumptions throughout your analysis. So incredibly important. And I think just generally, quite often, and I talk about this quite a bit in the guide, and the guide is largely centered around that. Talk about the guide later, but just the mistakes that tend to be made, both by I talk to a lot of GIS experts, and because it's such a technical, and not technical in the technology sense, but technical from like cartography, scientific point of view. Sometimes, quite often in the education space, what's been happening is that instead of teaching people cartographic principles and geographic principles, things like that, they're just learning about the technologies and they become experts in the technologies, but they don't really fully understand all the different ways that you should be doing analysis. So, for example, just the way that you split out communities can create stories that are not actually there. One example that I use often that people understand in the US is that the way we split different communities allows one party to win over the other. And depending on how you split it, that can determine an election. So that's things like that, where it's like how you split things, how you summarize things. For example, and especially in the environmental justice space, you might have data, let's say environmental data at one level, let's say the community level or the town level, but you might have just population data from another level. And what ends up happening quite often is that people just merge the two and call it a day and tell these stories. Some of the cases that I found were that in many cases, like environmental justice risks were being downplayed because of the way that things were being analyzed. So, for example, with certain algorithms, it would look way less risky or way less dangerous than it actually was. So it was really important to make sure that, yes, we're abstracting away all these, we're making the tools easier to use, but let's also remember that there's a certain sense of caution that has to go into it. And a little bit of knowledge doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has to go to school and learn these things. But also, as you said, like go back to the community. Does what I found make sense? In some cases, it's like everybody in this community is fine. Does that sound right? And then the community could go back and tell you, no, it's not right. Everyone here is coughing. There's something going on. And that really can serve as a gut check for things that might go wrong.
And you've also put together this guide on navigating AI, which is to help users use GIS platforms responsibly. So, could you tell us a little bit about the insights and recommendations in that guide?
Yeah, sure thing. I will probably also go back and tell you how it starts a little bit, just because, yeah, spoke with quite a few people. I'm originally from Costa Rica, so there's a lot of nature organizations here and people who are just very involved in the environment. And I had heard quite a few stories where, the data that the community collected, in one case in particular, the data that the community collected was used by a large resort company to decide where they should place the resort parts of their plan. So, for example, if a community had found a hot spring or a nice, beautiful area, the company was able to use that data to place a private resort hotel on top of it that now the community can't access. Also, I heard stories of, for example, we use quite a few of these animal tracking apps where you can take a picture of a bird or a rare bird, whatever it might be. At some point, poachers were using it to actually find the animals and collect them. So in some ways, collecting data actually makes it easier for people the wrong actors to do things. So it definitely was a flag for me that it's data on its own can be dangerous. Data with location can be even more dangerous. And so I started to jump in a little bit into the GIS world, as I mentioned, playing around with these platforms. And I really asked myself, as I mentioned before, it's not the people catching up to the technology, but the technology catching up to the people. It's how can I make this easier? As I mentioned before, a lot of times it's a communications officer just trying to make a map based on the data that was collected in the field or any other things. People are usually using multiple hats, and really wanted to make something that if you just needed to know the basics, removing all the jargon, you could really get started, understand some of the major things that can come up. And therefore, the guide is really structured in that sense. Just what are the things you need to think about? So, for example, thinking through the model that you're using, which in many cases, it's the default US model. So you definitely want to make sure that you switch that. Other things like the coordinate system that you use, also making sure that you're doing that, changing it to your local context. And then we jump into, and I really made it a point in the guide to start at foundations. So let's first make sure that we're using the right model. And then let's start diving into the analysis part. And there's when I'm talking with a lot of not just GIS experts, but also geographers. They really said these are the three main things that quite a lot of newbies or people that don't know how to work with maps do. And quite often it was, as I'd shared, like how people divide communities. Quite often it creates this narrative that might not be the case. And also, what is a local community? We might divide it in a certain way, but actual community members might divide it in a certain way. So keeping track of that. I also mentioned just the different levels and like normalization, how to make sure that you're talking at the same hierarchical level on both data sets and not creating or drawing conclusions that are not there. So yeah, quite a few analysis bits that are really important. It wasn't intended to be a guide to cover everything, but just really help us get started and understand like the ethical risks, the ways that we might not be telling the community story if we're not careful. And yeah, and it's meant to be an open source guide, so I hope that people continue to contribute to it and critique it and add feedback. And it grows as the sector continues to grow. But it really was meant to be a getting started guide to using GIS responsibly.
We'll share the link to the guide in the show notes and, of course, the link to both of your other work as well. Do you see some of the same risks in the Asian context? I'm also curious to get your perspective because compared to some of the more industrialized economies in the kind of global north, data protection regulation and other kind of regulatory frameworks are still comparatively nascent. So have you come across these or other kind of concerns in your work as well?
Yeah, I feel like without repeating what Katie said, the same challenges and risks apply to most countries. I do understand the risk of making some of this data easily available as we may encroach into the privacy and security risk or have the data manipulated in such a way that they will provide intentional outcomes that benefit a specific group of people. So the risk mitigation is a challenge. For example, when we're making flat risk maps available online, so some irresponsible people can manipulate the data in such a way that they lower the flood risk in certain areas to increase the housing prices, or they may increase the flood risk levels where they're not supposed to increase the insurance price. So at the same time, we need high quality and high resolution data for our geospatial AI models to provide meaningful results. But how do we ensure they're not being used by the wrong hands? So I think these are the ethical and social risks that we're dealing with. But Malaysia is quite conventional. So they're trying to keep most of this data or information guarded. So it's very hard to get this data from government agencies most of the time. So when the world in general is governed by proprietary software models and data providers, those with higher resources or access will definitely be controlling the outcomes of the geospatial AI models, and you may see a huge bias as it's not a level playing field. On the other hand, it can be quite dangerous to have everything open source with no regulation of control, as like I said, anyone can modify or develop the Geo AI model for the wrong reasons. And I find that the resolution or details for some of this data in Malaysia not sufficient for detailed modeling. Say you need details such as the number of households to make a proper risk assessment. This information is often not available unless you do your own field sampling, which will then cost you a lot of resources for just a small area. Unless you're just looking at a bigger scale, like a district level, then you may get some data you can work with, but that may not be as useful. So, in balancing the risk and the data accessibility, I think that's really one of the main issues in applying geospatial AI models here. Yeah.
Again, I think that resonates with a lot of the work that we've also been doing in other sectors as well, beyond kind of climate action. That open data and open source has huge benefits, but there is a kind of political economy or a kind of power imbalance that we need to also consider, which means that certain actors are able to leverage this more effectively or have the resources and even other forms of data intelligence that which they can then combine with this data to for their own commercial gain or other advantage. A final question to you both in terms of a call to action. What kind of investment or other kind of intervention do you think is required to be able to use GIS data, to be able to use AI to address climate action in a way that is equitable and safe and also addresses some of the issues? I know that's a very big question, and obviously there's not a single or simple answer, but if you wanted to highlight one key aspect that you think, especially the global development community, the philanthropic community, government agencies should prioritize? Is there any one thing that is top of mind for either of you?
Well, I can start for equitable access and outcomes. Katie said this before, transparency. I think transparency is a huge factor. And in order to have transparent Geo AI applications, naturally common infrastructure, software, models, data ensure free access, especially for those with limited resources in global south. These common resources require high investment, but they are essential to make sure that GeoAI benefits everyone regardless of their backgrounds. So when the models are not transparent, the users cannot understand how the models make decisions. So we need to encourage open access to data and methodologies to promote transparency. And I believe that the data collection methodology should be documented and include diverse demographics, obviously. We need to implement a technology that will allow simultaneous access, validation, and record updating across the network database. So users can then view any changes and who made them, reducing the need to audit data and also to ensure that the data is reliable. So this will also provide traceability to securely handle data information and stakeholders' identities. So it's a way to manage the certificates of geospatial spatial data to ensure that they're authentic before being used for real life applications. Now, I spoke about policy before because I think that's important to make sure that they're being implemented in practice. So regulators and policymakers are in a position to create policies for developers on setting accountability for how models and data are developed and used. Policymakers are also in a unique position to oversee how models access our data and how public data should be governed. So I think that's one of the key things to achieve transparency.
Fantastic. Thank you. Kathy, over to you.
Yeah, I think for me, it would be centering the people and communities that we intend to serve throughout the entire process. At the point of data collection, are we listening to the community? Are we handling their data safely? When we're analyzing, are we telling their story correctly? And I think one thing that was not mentioned as much was in terms of geo AI, are we actually causing further harm to the planet in using these technologies? As we all know, AI is really resource intensive. So just being really mindful that we're not using geo AI to create thousands of images of an area while at the same time creating harm to the area via data centers, via the heating of the planet, whatever it might be. So just maintaining front and center that this is actually to benefit people and the communities and the planet that we live on. So making sure that's thought throughout every decision that we make. And yeah, I think just making sure that we are uplifting the communities that we work with and remembering that it's a tool, not a solution in itself. I think that's the same with all technologies that we hear about. Yeah, these are GIS won't solve everything. GeoAI will also not solve everything, but it's one of many tools in our toolbox that we can use to get the planet, get our communities to the point that they need to be safe.
Totally. Couldn't agree with you more. And I'm so glad you also brought up the climate costs of all these technologies. This is not happening without a significant environmental impact. And I hope that's something that we'll also touch upon in one of the later episodes in this series. But thank you. Thank you both so much for taking the time out to speak to me. I learned a lot. I think we covered a range of topics, from the opportunities, including really specific examples from two very different geographies, the risks. In some sense, it's reassuring to hear that the risks are also similar across places. Maybe that gives us also an opportunity to come together and share lessons and share experiences on how we combat the risks. And I couldn't agree more around the kind of points around transparency and really the judicious use around technology, not being wasteful, and how and where we use it. So thank you both very much. And yeah, I'm sure our listeners would have also learned a lot. Thank you. Thank you for tuning into today's episode. We'll be back next month with more conversations. Don't forget to subscribe and do sign up for our monthly newsletter at codegreen.asia. I'm Urvishia Neja, and on behalf of Digital Futures Lab, thank you for listening.